Wasn't a desert at all. It was a lush savanna teeming with rivers, lakes, and grasslands. Scientists call this era the African humid period, but what made it truly special wasn't just the weather, it was the people who lived there and the mystery of where they came from. Bold, hidden, deep, real, mist. Now imagine this: crocodiles basking on riverbanks in what's now Algeria, giraffes roaming through grassy fields in Libya, and humans thriving. During this period, ancient people fished, hunted, and eventually herded cattle in what we today think of as an unlivable desert. They painted scenes of daily life on rock walls, wild animals, cattle, human figures. We find their tools, their pottery, and even their graves. Some skeletons were so well preserved by the desert's dry conditions that we call them natural mummies. These people lived in places like the Takarkori rock shelter in southwest Libya and the Tadrat Akakas mountains, where archaeologists unearthed signs of settlement stretching back over 10,000 years. But until recently, the one thing we didn't have was their DNA. Gone, painted, buried, still, silent. And that silence lasted decades. Researchers had long suspected that these Green Sahara people held secrets. The artifacts were there, the cultural complexity was undeniable, but DNA doesn't do well in hot, humid environments. And most of North Africa was considered too harsh to preserve ancient genomes. Scientists guessed at their ancestry based on tools or burial styles, but it was like trying to solve a mystery novel with half the pages missing. Dry, cracked, fragile, elusive, incomplete. So the big question lingered: who were they? Were they migrants from sub-Saharan Africa who moved north during this wet phase? Were they farmers from the Levant who had pushed west? Or were they something else entirely, but a forgotten people? Rooted, drifting, blended, cut off, native. All of that changed with a paper published in Nature in April 2025. For the first time, scientists were able to extract and sequence DNA from human remains found in the Green Sahara, and what they found rewrites the story of North Africa, because these ancient people weren't who you think they were. Revealed. Shock. DNA. Realigned. Start. For decades, we had bones, tools, and paintings, but no voice, no DNA. That silence was finally broken in April 2025. A team led by the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology published a landmark study in Nature, revealing the first ever ancient DNA from the heart of the Green Sahara. It came from Takarkori Rock Shelter, a site tucked in the desert of southwestern Libya. And it's not just any site. It's a place where people lived continuously for thousands of years. From hunter-gatherers to herders, this was a cultural crossroads. But no one expected what was hiding inside those bones. Quiet, remote, crucial, waiting, old. The real shock? They got it from two women. Buried around 7,000 years ago during the African humid period, their remains were dry, perfectly preserved by millennia of desert heat. Ancient DNA doesn't usually survive in conditions like this. That's why archaeologists had long written off most of North Africa as a genetic dead zone. But with newer techniques, better lab protocols, and sheer persistence, the team managed to extract and sequence nearly complete genomes from both individuals. It was a scientific long shot, and it paid off. Against odds. Stubborn. Fragile, precise. And what they found was something no one had cataloged before. When the genomes were analyzed, the results pointed to a previously unknown lineage, a population group distinct from sub-Saharan Africans, distinct from Near Easterners, and even distinct from most modern North Africans. These women weren't immigrants. They weren't recent arrivals. They belonged to a deeply rooted North African branch of humanity that had been isolated for tens of thousands of years. Isolated, local, ancient, separate, unique. But there was still a twist. While 93% of their ancestry came from this lost North African lineage, about 7% showed signs of admixture from a Levantine-like source. Just a sliver, but it tells a story. Not of conquest or mass migration, but of limited, occasional contact. The kind that comes with trade, travelers, or maybe even a handful of settlers. The rest? Completely native. Trace. Faint. Glint. Whisper. Barely. So when people assumed the Sahara was a mixing bowl, they were wrong. The DNA doesn't lie. These women living at the center of a once thriving savanna weren't a blend of nearby empires. They were the descendants of a people who had been there all along. Silent, present, preserved, rooted, real. This is where things get weird. When researchers sequenced the DNA of the two Takar women, they ran it through the usual comparisons: modern Africans, ancient farmers, Near Eastern herders, and then, out of curiosity, they compared it to one of the oldest full genome modern humans ever discovered, a 45,000-year-old individual from Zlatykun Cave in Czechia. What they found was stunning. The Sahara women were genetically closer to Zlatykun than to any sub-Saharan African group alive today. Curveball. Shocking, unexpected, ancient, close. That finding flips a huge assumption on its head. For years it was assumed that African populations, especially ones still on the continent, would naturally be more genetically similar to each other than to those who migrated out. But these Takarkori individuals weren't just different. They were genetically closer to the early out-of-Africa migrants in Europe than to modern groups in East or West Africa. Despite both groups being on the same continent, the Sahara women and sub-Saharan peoples had drifted far apart, split, separate, far, distant, unrelated. So what happened? Time, isolation, and genetic drift. This mysterious North African lineage likely broke off from the rest of the human family tree about 50,000 years ago. Around the same time modern humans were expanding out of East Africa into the rest of the world, some groups left the continent, but some, like this one, stayed behind. Not in the lush green forest of the Congo or the Great Rift Valley, but in the far north, where they eventually became trapped by geography and climate shifts. Fork, early, alone, drift, fixed. And it's important to stress, these people weren't a mix. The DNA shows almost no sub-Saharan ancestry, no blending, no genetic flood. Even during the African humid period, when rivers ran through the Sahara and migration should have been easy, these populations stayed genetically separate. They were not the ancestors of modern Bantu-speaking populations or Nilotic peoples. They were their own branch, a branch that survived on its own. Pure, shielded, resistant, distinct, preserved. This means something big. Location doesn't always mean relation. Just because people lived in Africa doesn't mean they were part of a pan-African genetic community. Geography isn't destiny. These were Africans, but genetically closer to ancient Europeans. A paradox that forces us to rethink what ancestry really means. DNA, place, puzzle, history, truth. So now that we know who these people were, let's talk about what they did. Around 7,000 years ago, the Central Sahara saw a massive cultural shift. The people at Takakori went from hunting and gathering to herding domesticated animals. They raised cattle, they lived in structured communities, they created rock art that showed scenes of everyday pastoral life. The transformation is obvious in the archaeological record: bones of cattle, changes in diet, new settlement patterns. But here's the twist: the DNA says they didn't get this lifestyle from an invading people. Shift. Change, scene, cattle, every day. The genes stayed the same, the culture didn't. The genomes of the Takakori women show no significant admixture from the Levant or the Near East. In other words, even though herding and animal domestication began in those regions, those people didn't migrate en masse into the Sahara to bring those ideas with them. Instead, this ancient North African group learned about pastoralism and adopted it. They copied the idea without importing the people. Same, steady, idea, borrowed, kept. This is one of the clearest examples we have of cultural diffusion without genetic replacement. Just like in the Tarim Basin, where mummies with ancient North Eurasian ancestry picked up Indo-European cultural traits without being descended from Europeans, the Takakori herders gained new technologies while remaining biologically the same. Or take Neolithic Europe,